Welcome back. This is the fourth episode of the first block of theory lessons. In this episode, we will talk about HABs generated by diatoms as well as their harmful effects. Diatoms are unicellular eukaryotic microalgae that are present in the oceans, freshwater bodies, soils, even in damp surfaces, and can be found from the poles to the tropics. So basically, we find diatoms absolutely everywhere worldwide. According to recent estimates, there are approximately between 12,000 to 30,000 species of diatoms. If you look at this map here, these are just distributions of diatoms along the world in January and in June, and you can see that we can find them absolutely everywhere, from the poles to tropical regions, everywhere. The good thing is that most diatoms are beneficial for the ocean's ecosystems and, of course, ultimately to human health. Why are they so beneficial? The first thing is because they generate approximately 20% of the oxygen produced each year on the planet, which is a similar percentage to all the tropical rainforests together. If we have a look at the photosynthesis equation, diatoms, as well as any other phytoplankton species, they use CO2 that is dissolved in the water column. They combine it with water, and together with the energy from sunlight, they create oxygen and glucose. We'll talk about glucose later. But they do produce oxygen through the photosynthesis process. They are also beneficial because they contribute between 40 to 45% of the total production of organic compounds in the oceans, or between 20 to 25% if we take into account the entire Earth. So if we go back to the photosynthesis equation, we said that they combine CO2 with water and sunlight to produce oxygen and glucose. And what happens with this glucose? Phytoplankton, any phytoplankton and also diatoms, they use this glucose as a source of food, as a food source to grow. So glucose is a form of organic carbon, but as the phytoplankton cells grow, they create different forms of organic carbon. But not only this, they also represent a significant source of food for other organisms in the marine food web. Let's not forget that diatoms are phytoplankton and they are the base of the food web in the ocean. And finally, they also play an important role in the biogeochemical cycling of elements, because as they die and sink, bacteria will remineralize this organic carbon and produce nutrients. If we have a look at this image here, we can see that diatoms are not only consumed by organisms in the surface waters, but as they sink, they are also consumed in deeper layers, even at depths more than 5 kilometers in the ocean. They have found diatoms, so they are basically everywhere. They are also beneficial because they play an important role in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and this is because they are large and they sink rapidly. Let's go back to the photosynthesis equation. We said that they uptake CO2 to do the photosynthesis. So this CO2 of atmospheric origin, when it dissolves in the water column, is used by phytoplankton in general and diatoms in particular to do the photosynthesis. And because we said that they are large organisms, as they die, they start sinking rapidly. So what they're actually doing is this: they transport this CO2 that is being converted into organic carbon, they transport it to the sediments. So it is a good thing because they are actually capturing our own pollution, okay, from carbon. If we have a look at the distribution, at the percentage of export of organic carbon by phytoplankton in general, which is the darker color, and diatoms in particular, which is the pale blue color, from the southern hemisphere up to the northern hemisphere, we can see that diatoms represent almost half of the export of organic carbon for all the phytoplankton species together. So they are very, very important in the oceanic food web. We also said that because they are large and they sink rapidly, when they capture this CO2 that are linked to climate change, what they're actually doing is help reducing this atmospheric pollution, okay? Well, if you remember, the link between CO2 and climate change, it is because CO2 is a greenhouse, and greenhouses, what they are doing is preventing that the solar radiation that enters the Earth and is reflected back up, it is preventing that this solar radiation, this reflected solar radiation goes back into the space. We are keeping it in our atmosphere, and this is what is actually warming up our atmosphere. So diatoms, they help reducing this greenhouse, these CO2 levels. So I have included diatoms in a harmful algae bloom lessons, but I'm only talking about how good they are, how beneficial they are for the environment, for us. Do they actually have any harmful effects? Well, they do. First thing, if you remember when we talked about coastal upwellings, we said that diatoms are more abundant during spring. So in spring, if we have enough nutrients and the light conditions are favorable, the sun starts getting stronger, we have more sunlight, and the water starts warming up, diatoms grow rapidly and they can dominate over other phytoplankton communities. The bloom of some diatom species might color the water, and they can cause a red tide like the one we can see in this image here. The freshwater diatom Didymosphenia geminata, which is also called known as Didymo, it can cause what we know as nuisance blooms. They are non-toxic, but nuisance blooms can have been defined as masses of cells and stalks that extend for large areas, even more than 1 kilometer, and persist for several months of the year. And they look something like we see in this picture. These blooms, what they actually cause is severe environmental degradation by producing these large quantities of a brown jelly-like material that is called brown snot or rock snot. And the problem with this is that because it's so thick and the bloom is so massive that, for starters, they block the sunlight and they can kill anything that is underneath and needs the sunlight to survive. And also we have a lot of organic matter, so when they die, they will create hypoxic problems. These two images here, they show this Didymo, this Didymosphenia geminata diatom species, and on the left-hand side we can see this shiny thing is this Didymo, and is their natural occurrence. This is, for example, in the splash zone of a stream. It's very common to find this shiny thing. These are this Didymosphenia. But when they grow massively, this is when they become a nuisance, like we can also see in this other image here. See these massive stalks of algae. This is a lot of organic matter that needs to be degraded by bacteria, so we will need a lot of oxygen. But not only this, some diatom species can also harm marine organisms in other ways. Although they don't have an impact on human health because they are non-toxic, but they can harm marine organisms. For example, they can harm them physically because they are large and they have these funny shapes, these spiky shapes. If fish drinks water with a big concentration of diatoms, their gills, they can get stuck in their gills, and they can harm the gills, and fish can actually asphyxiate. Okay, but as I was just mentioning, because they create these nuisance blooms, they can also trigger hypoxic conditions when they die. I don't know if you have ever seen a bacteria inside the diatom cell. Oops. But it is worth watching it. Let's have a look at it. As you can see in this video, this square thing is a diatom diatom that is dying, and all the shiny things that you can see sparkling here, that they are not sparkling, they're simply moving very fast, they are bacteria that they are degrading this dying diatom. So let's imagine we have these massive nuisance blooms. So we have, if this is only one cell of diatom, let's imagine how many bacteria we need for a full bloom of diatoms. Okay? Only very few species of diatoms, which is less than 20 species, can produce toxins that are harmful for mollusks, marine mammals, birds, or even humans. If we remember how many diatom species we have, which is between approximately 12,000 to 30,000 species, these 20 species represent between 0.07 and 0.17% of the diatom species, so almost nothing. But there are some species that they can be toxic. One example is Pseudoniscia, that produces a compound called domotic acid that is toxic to humans and to other animals. The syndrome of this toxin in humans is called amnesic shellfish poisoning because one of its reported symptoms is memory loss. I don't know if you remember that when we started talking about hubs, we said that the same species might have a different toxicity under different environmental conditions. Well, do you remember Pseudoniscia australis? We mentioned that it creates large blooms in the California system, that they are very toxic. It creates moderate blooms with a lower toxicity in the Northwest African upwelling system, and it's also found in abundant concentrations in the Benguela current system, but is non-toxic at all. Well, this example was a diatom. So far, we have seen harmful effects that hubs can have on the environment and on human health. So if you want to learn about other harmful effects from hubs, please join me in the next episode. Thank you. See you in the next episode.